ever feel like you remember something perfectly and then later you find out you were like totally wrong?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
It's kind of like this thing that happened after the Challenger disaster.
Oh, yeah.
This professor asked all of his students to write down exactly where they were when they heard the news.
Okay.
And then 2.5 years later,
Oh, wow.
he asked them again, and fewer than 1 in 10 actually got the details right. Isn't that
Oh,
crazy?
that's wild. Yeah.
But here's the thing that's even crazier.
Okay.
Almost all of them were certain that their memories were completely accurate.
Mm. Wow.
So it turns out that feeling of certainty we all have
Yeah.
doesn't always reflect reality.
Oh, no.
So in this deep dive, we are going to explore that very human tendency to be wrong but think we're right.
Okay.
And we are going to be taking excerpts from the book I'm Right, You're Wrong by Sia Mohajer to do that.
I love that book.
It's a great book. And we're going to be learning about all those sneaky mental shortcuts that we call logical fallacies and hopefully learn how to spot them in ourselves and in other people
Yeah.
and just become more clear and critical thinkers in the process.
I think what's so fascinating about this is that our brains are actually wired for arguments,
Really?
not necessarily truth.
Oh.
Our reasoning skills actually evolved to persuade others not to be objective and analyze facts.
So you're saying cavemen weren't just sitting around like debating philosophy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were way more focused on survival, trying to convince each other which cave was safer or who should lead the hunt.
Makes sense.
Persuasion was key to survival, not finding some like absolute truth.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I think that this book dives into how those ancient instincts still drive us today,
Absolutely.
still making us make bad decisions.
Yeah, Mohajer shows how we often trip ourselves up with those logical fallacies, which are those like common errors in reasoning that make ridiculous arguments sound convincing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the first step to avoiding them is understanding like why we fall for them in the first place.
So what is the root of the problem here?
I think it's that feeling of certainty that we all crave. Our brains reward us with all these like feel-good chemicals like dopamine when we win an argument. So it makes us feel like we're right, even if we're totally wrong.
Oh, wow.
It's like that Challenger study.
Right.
Our brains want to feel certain, even if our memories are fuzzy.
Yeah.
And that makes it really hard to change our minds, even when we're presented with evidence that directly contradicts our beliefs.
So we're kind of stuck in a certainty trap.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we break free?
I think by learning to recognize these logical fallacies.
Okay.
Let's start with one we see all the time, especially in politics and like online debates. The ad hominem,
Okay.
that classic move of attacking the person instead of the argument.
Oh, like when someone says you can't trust anything, she says she's a convicted felon.
Exactly. Instead of engaging with the actual argument, they attack the person's character, trying to discredit them and make your argument seem less valid.
Right. It's such a distraction tactic.
Yeah.
And speaking of distractions, there's another one, the two-quote fallacy,
Oh, yeah.
which is basically like the you too defense.
Right.
You deflect criticism by pointing out that the other person is guilty of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like if someone accuses you of speeding,
Yeah.
and you're like, well, you were speeding last week.
Right.
Yeah.
It's totally irrelevant to the original argument. It's a way of just shifting the focus away from the issue at hand and avoiding accountability.
And it works a lot of the time.
And sadly, it often works.
Yeah, people think two wrongs make a right or something.
Yeah.
Which we all know is not true.
Totally.
But hey, at least they're not like pretending to be experts
Yeah.
on topics they know nothing about.
Oh, yeah.
Which brings us to,
The appeal to authority fallacy.
okay,
This one's sneaky because it plays on our tendency to trust people that we see as experts.
Right.
It's about accepting a claim as true, just because someone important or famous said it without actually looking at the evidence.
yeah, Mohajer uses the example of that tongue map that we all learned in school
Oh, right. Yeah.
that supposedly showed like where each taste bud was located.
Uh-huh.
And it was in textbooks for decades, but it turns out it was based on a mistranslation.
Really?
And it was completely wrong.
Wow.
But no one really questioned it because it came from what they thought was a credible source.
It just reminds us that even experts can be wrong.
Right.
And we should always be critical of information, even if it comes from a seemingly authoritative source.
Yeah.
Always ask yourself, what's the evidence? Is this information based on solid research or just someone's opinion?
It's not about blindly trusting authority figures. It's
Yeah.
about thinking for ourselves and evaluating the information that we're given.
Exactly.
Okay.
And another tactic that tries to manipulate our thinking is the straw man fallacy.
Okay.
It's kind of like setting up a scarecrow and pretending it's your opponent. You misrepresent their argument, making it easier to attack, and then you knock it down.
I see this one all the time in political debates.
Yeah, me too.
When one candidate will oversimplify their opponent's stance on like a very complex issue,
Totally.
and it's super easy to dismiss.
It's a classic way to just avoid engaging with the nuances of an argument and instead just create this distorted version that's way easier to attack.
Totally. And while we're on the topic of like simplification, let's talk about the black and white fallacy, where you present only two options,
Right.
when in reality there are so many more.
Yeah. Think about that famous quote, "You're either with us or you're against us."
Oh, yeah.
It creates that false dichotomy that forces people to choose a side
Right.
and kind of eliminates any room for nuance or critical thinking.
It's a very powerful rhetorical tool,
Oh, yeah.
but it can also be incredibly misleading
Totally.
because most issues are way more complex than just a simple either-or choice.
Absolutely. It's a way of shutting down dialogue and discouraging people from considering other perspectives. And that lack of critical thinking is precisely what allows these fallacies to thrive.
Yeah.
We get so caught up in the emotions, the desire to be right, that we just forget to step back and think, is this actually logical?
So how do we break free from that?
I think we need to cultivate metacognition,
Meta what? What?
which is basically thinking about your own thinking.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Hey.
it's about questioning your assumptions,
Okay.
being willing to admit we might be wrong, and actively seeking out diverse perspectives.
It's like having a built-in BS detector for our own thoughts.
Exactly.
Like that.
Yeah, it's about becoming aware of those like automatic thought patterns and challenging them.
That sounds like a recipe for some serious mental discomfort.
It can be.
But I guess that's the price of becoming like a clearer thinker.
I think it's a journey, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
And Mohajer offers some really helpful guidance on how to actually get started.
Yeah.
And one of the key insights is understanding how deeply ingrained our need to feel right actually is.
Yeah, he talks about how we literally get like a dopamine hit
Yeah.
when we win arguments.
Totally.
And that makes it so hard to back down even when we know we should.
Yeah.
It's like we're addicted to being right.
Uh-huh.
And to feed that addiction, we often fall into another trap, the anecdotal evidence fallacy,
Oh, yeah.
where we give way too much weight to like personal stories and experiences, even when they completely contradict like broader data.
Right. It's like those anti-vaccination arguments
Oh, yeah.
that focus on just like a handful of scary stories
Right.
while ignoring tons of scientific evidence showing that vaccines are safe and effective.
So we're all basically walking bundles of biases and logical fallacies, just trying to make sense of the world.
It seems like it, yeah.
That's a pretty humbling thought.
It is humbling, but I think it's also liberating.
Okay.
Once we recognize our own fallibility, we can start to approach like arguments and information with way more humility and curiosity.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's not about being right all the time.
Right.
It's about being open to being wrong
Yeah.
and constantly refining our understanding.
I think that's what this deep dive is all about.
Me too.
It seems like we're all kind of prone to building those little echo chambers in our minds,
Oh, yeah, totally.
filtering out anything that challenges our own like cherished beliefs.
And to make things worse, we have that bandwagon fallacy just reinforcing those echo chambers.
Oh, yeah.
Like if everyone else believes it, it must be true.
Right, like all those times when like a health fad becomes all the rage
Uh,
and then it later turns out to be bogus.
totally bogus.
Mohajer gives some pretty hilarious examples in the book,
Oh, yeah.
like radioactive drinks
Oh, my
and
God.
tapeworm diet pills.
Dude,
It makes you wonder what current trends we'll all be shaking our heads at in a few years.
I'm putting my money on detox teas.
Probably a good bet, yeah.
Speaking of trends, have you ever noticed how we tend to just jump to conclusions
Oh, yeah.
about cause and effect?
All the time.
Just because two things happen around the same time
Yeah.
doesn't mean one caused the other.
Right.
This is the false cause fallacy.
It's
like that bit in the book about sour cream consumption
Oh, yeah.
and motorcycle accidents.
Right.
They correlate almost perfectly, but obviously one didn't cause the other.
Right, but our brains just love finding patterns.
Yeah.
We want explanations, and sometimes the simplest one is just too tempting. Even if it makes zero logical sense.
Especially when those explanations are like tugging at our heartstrings.
Yeah.
That's where the appeal to emotion fallacy comes in.
Ah, yes, the master manipulator. Instead of using logic and evidence, it goes straight for the gut punch.
Yeah, think of those commercials with like sad puppies
Oh, yeah.
or starving children.
Yeah.
They just want to make you feel something, not necessarily think critically.
Right. It's all about triggering an emotional response. making you more likely to donate or support a cause without actually examining the facts.
So are you saying we should just like turn off our emotions and become robots?
No, not at
No.
all. It's about recognizing that emotions are super powerful, but they shouldn't be the only factor that's driving our decisions.
Okay.
We have to find that balance between like our heart and our head.
So how do we become less susceptible to emotional manipulation?
I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
Recognize when you're feeling a strong emotional pull
Right.
and ask yourself, is this influencing my judgment? Am I actually being presented with solid evidence, or is it just a sob story?
It's like separating the genuine argument from like the really well-disguised sales pitch.
Totally. Speaking of disguised pitches,
Right.
let's talk about the argument from ignorance,
Okay.
which is like saying, if you can't prove me wrong, I must be right.
Oh, like I believe in Bigfoot because no one has ever proven he doesn't exist.
Exactly. The burden of proof should always be with the person making the claim, not the person who is questioning it.
Okay.
And a lot of the times, this fallacy goes hand in hand with special pleading,
Special pleading, which is like,
which is basically like saying the rules don't apply to me
Right.
because
Yes.
I'm special.
okay, so here's one I'm definitely guilty of. The appeal to nature fallacy.
Oh, yeah.
That idea that if something is natural, it must be good for you.
Ah, yes, the allure of all things organic and chemical free.
Right.
But, as Mohajer points out, poison ivy is totally natural,
That's true.
but no one's lining up to get a dose of that.
No, and those
Yeah.
tapeworm diet pills we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
natural but in a very unhealthy way.
Yeah.
We seem to really romanticize nature,
Yeah,
forgetting that it can be pretty harsh and unforgiving.
definitely. It's important to remember that natural doesn't automatically equal good.
Yeah.
We have to evaluate things based on evidence and logic,
Okay.
not just this vague sense of what feels natural.
So nature gave us sunsets and bunnies, but also poison ivy and mosquitoes.
Exactly.
What about when people try to like find a middle ground
Yeah.
between two extreme positions?
Yeah, it can be kind of tricky.
Yeah.
Because sometimes one side is just like flat out wrong.
Right.
And compromising just muddles the water and gives credibility to false ideas.
Right.
This is the middle ground fallacy.
Like saying, let's agree to disagree when one person's arguing the earth is flat.
Right, that's not a compromise. That's
Yeah.
just bad science.
Exactly. And speaking of bad arguments, disguised as clever questions.
You're thinking of the loaded question fallacy, right?
I am, yeah.
It's like that classic example, have you stopped beating your wife yet?
Right. No matter how you answer.
Yeah, you're trapped.
It's like a rhetorical trick
Yeah,
to put someone on the defensive.
right, and make them look bad regardless of their actual stance.
It's like sneaking in an assumption under the guise of an innocent question.
Right, and that's why it's so important to be vigilant.
Yeah.
When a question feels loaded, call it out for what it is.
Okay.
Don't let yourself be cornered into a false dichotomy.
I like that.
Okay, good.
Speaking of distorting reality,
Oh, yeah.
the next fallacy is all about manipulating data.
Oh.
What's that one where you like draw the target around the bullet holes after you've already shot?
Oh, you're talking about the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
I am.
It's all about cherry-picking data
Right.
to support a conclusion that you already had while ignoring any evidence that might contradict it.
Yeah. Mohajer uses the example from World War II,
Oh, right.
where Londoners thought German bombs were deliberately missing certain neighborhoods,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
and they suspected those buildings housed spies.
Interesting.
But it turned out the bombing patterns were totally random.
Just random. Yeah.
It just goes to show how easily we can be fooled by randomness.
Yeah, for sure. Our brains are always looking for patterns,
Yeah.
even when they don't exist.
We see what we want to see,
Yeah.
even in the chaos.
Okay. Let's wrap up this part of the deep dive with one final fallacy.
Okay.
What about when people use, like, circular reasoning to support their arguments?
You mean like begging the question?
Yeah, begging the question.
Where the conclusion is already assumed in the premise?
Exactly. It's like that classic example. Why is Bob so dumb? The question itself presumes that Bob is dumb
Yeah.
without offering any actual evidence.
It's just a way of making the argument seem self-evident
Right.
when it's actually based on an assumption that hasn't been looked at.
Right. And it can be a really subtle way to just shut down critical thinking.
Totally.
It's like trying to define a word by using the same word in the definition. It
Yeah.
gets you nowhere.
So how do we escape this circular trap?
I think by just developing the habit of questioning your own assumptions,
Okay.
ask yourself, why do I believe this? What evidence do I have? And am I actually willing to consider other viewpoints?
Right.
It takes a conscious effort to break free from those like ingrained thought patterns.
It's like we're rewiring our brains to be more discerning
Exactly.
and less prone to accepting things at face value.
Yeah, and the more we practice this kind of self-reflection, the better we become at actually spotting these fallacies,
Yeah.
not just in other people,
Mm-hmm.
but also in ourselves.
And that's what truly empowers us to think more clearly and have better conversations.
Yeah, and make better decisions.
Right. Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into logical fallacies.
Yeah, it's like we've been on like a mental scavenger hunt
Totally.
for flawed reasoning.
And I gotta say, even after like learning all this stuff,
Yeah.
I still catch myself
Yeah.
falling for these tricks sometimes.
That's totally normal.
Is it?
Oh, yeah. Remember these biases are like super ingrained in how we think?
Right.
It takes a while. It takes practice to actually like rewire those habits.
Yeah, it's like our brains are constantly trying to look for those shortcuts,
Uh-huh.
even if they lead us to the wrong conclusions.
Exactly. And that's why cultivating critical thinking is so important.
Okay.
It's about developing the awareness to kind of pause and question our automatic thought patterns.
Mohajer calls it metacognition, right?
Right.
Thinking about our own thinking.
Yeah.
It's like becoming the observer of our own minds.
And that's where the real power lies. Once we can observe our thoughts, we can start to detach from them and evaluate them more objectively.
Yeah.
So instead of being swept away by emotion or bias, we can make space for logic and reason.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to understand these fallacies like in theory,
Right.
but it's way harder to catch them in the heat of the moment,
Totally.
especially when we're like emotionally invested.
Exactly. One of the simplest but most effective techniques is to just slow down.
Okay.
When you feel that surge of I'm right, you're wrong,
Yeah.
that's your cue to just like hit the pause button.
It's like taking a mental breath before you react.
Exactly. That pause allows us to engage those critical thinking skills.
Right.
Ask yourself like, okay, what assumptions am I making? What evidence do I actually have? And am I truly open to hearing another perspective?
That last one is so key, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If we're not willing to even entertain the idea that we might be wrong, then we're just shutting ourselves off from learning and growing.
Exactly. It takes humility to admit we might not have all the answers
Mm.
and that our understanding is always evolving.
So it's not about being right all the time.
Right.
It's about being open to new information and being willing to adjust your views.
Exactly. And that's what makes this journey of critical thinking so interesting.
Yeah.
It's about refining our understanding of the world and becoming more discerning thinkers.
It's like we've equipped ourselves with a mental toolkit
Yeah.
for spotting faulty logic
Right.
and just constructing more sound arguments.
And the best part is we can use these tools not just in like debates and arguments,
Yeah.
but in all areas of life.
I like that.
Yeah.
So to recap, the next time you're in a heated discussion, remember to slow down.
Yes.
Question your assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and be willing to admit you might be wrong.
And most importantly, approach the conversation with curiosity
Okay.
and a genuine desire to understand, not just to win.
Because ultimately, it's not about proving who's right or wrong.
Right.
It's about coming together to get closer to the truth.
I love that. Well said.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive
Okay.
into the fascinating world of arguments and logical fallacies.
It's been a journey.
It has been.
Yeah.
Remember, the path to becoming a more critical thinker
Right.
is a journey, not a destination.
It's about constantly reflecting and challenging your own biases.
Right.
And striving to be just more informed and discerning.
So keep exploring,
Yeah.
keep questioning, and keep those mental BS detectors activated.
Absolutely.
Until next time, happy deep diving, everyone.